June 6, 1944. 15 hours. The wind moved gently across the Normandy coast, carrying the smell of salt and damp earth. In the concrete bunker at Strongpoint WN62 overlooking Omaha Beach, 19-year-old Gefreiter Hinrich So wiped the barrel of his MG-42 machine gun with the care of a craftsman tending to a prized instrument. The steel felt cool beneath his fingers, the rhythmic sound of cloth against metal the only thing breaking the silence. In his breast pocket rested a folded letter from his girlfriend, written in looping cursive from her village of Metzingen. She had promised to wait for him, to believe in a future that seemed as solid as the Atlantic wall around him. He had written back confidently, "The invasion will be their grave. We will throw them back into the sea within hours." It was the sort of line young soldiers told themselves when the future still seemed like something they could control. 3 days earlier, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel himself had stood in this very bunker, his sharp eyes tracing the overlapping fields of fire that stretched across the sand. Through the embrasure, he had observed the calm waters of the channel and nodded with approval. "When they come," he said quietly, "this beach will be their cemetery." To men like So, those words felt prophetic. They had poured millions of tons of concrete, constructed hundreds of bunkers, mines, and obstacles, an entire coastline transformed into a fortress. It was the might of German engineering made tangible, the symbol of their faith in invincibility. Outside, the night was tranquil, the sea a great mirror reflecting the stars. No ships, no sound of engines, only the whispering tide. It was impossible to imagine that beneath that darkness, across the cold waters of the Channel, an armada unlike any in human history was already moving. At the same hour, far out to sea, Private Robert Shanklin of the 1st Infantry Division stood on the deck of a transport ship, gripping the railing as waves slammed against the hull. The men beside him were quiet. Some prayed, others smoked in silence, their faces pale in the dim red glow of the ship's lights. The channel was rough and many were seasick, but the greater sickness was fear. They had been told the enemy's defenses were impregnable, that the first waves might suffer 70% casualties. Yet, when the order came to prepare to land, not one man hesitated. In his pocket, Shanklin carried a small photograph of his wife and newborn daughter. He would later write that he remembered staring at that photograph as the coastline appeared, like a faint gray smudge in the mist, wondering if he would ever see them again. Hours earlier, on June 5th, German meteorologist Walter Stube had confidently reported that no invasion could occur. The weather over the channel was terrible. Winds of 25 knots, waves up to 6 feet, thick clouds hanging low. The Luftwaffe patrols were grounded, and even naval sweeps had been canceled. Stube's report, based on limited data from U-boats and coastal stations, convinced the German High Command that the Allies would delay for at least 2 weeks. Rommel, reassured, left France to visit his wife for her birthday, carrying a pair of suede shoes he had bought her in Paris. Across the front, officers relaxed. Many attended war games in Rennes. Others slept soundly in billets far from their posts. The Atlantic wall was strong. The weather was impossible. The enemy, they believed, would not dare. But on the other side of the channel, in a small room lit by flickering lamps, Group Captain James Stagg of the Royal Air Force studied weather charts that told a different story. From weather stations in Greenland and reconnaissance flights over the Atlantic, he saw a brief window, a lull in the storm. 36 hours of improved conditions, just enough. When he presented this to General Eisenhower, the room fell silent. The decision weighed not only on the fate of an army, but on the course of history itself. Eisenhower stared at the table for a long time before finally saying, "Okay, let's go." And so, in defiance of storm and expectation, the greatest armada ever assembled began to move. By 23:15 hours on June 5th, German radar operators at stations along the Norman coast began to detect strange patterns, unusual echoes on their Freya and Würzburg sets, massive aerial formations approaching from the north. But they had seen this before. Allied deception raids meant to test defenses. Reports came in, were logged, and largely dismissed. Then, after midnight, something unprecedented happened. Paratroopers began landing across Normandy, east, west, everywhere at once. German officers couldn't make sense of the reports. Some claimed the troops were British, others American. Some said hundreds, others thousands. In truth, the Allies had unleashed one of the most sophisticated deception operations of the war, Operation Titanic. Dummy paratroopers carrying firecrackers to simulate gunfire fell across miles of countryside, confusing entire divisions. Major Hans von Luck of the 21st Panzer Division was among the first to recognize the danger. He was awakened by frantic calls from outposts reporting parachutes near his positions. He requested immediate permission to attack. The order from headquarters came back. Do not move until the situation clarifies. Von Luck later wrote, "At that moment, I knew we were lost. Every minute we waited gave them time to consolidate, but our command structure was frozen by its own caution." As dawn approached, the mist over the channel began to lift. German sentries in forward bunkers rubbed their eyes in disbelief. From horizon to horizon stretched a sight so vast that words failed. It was as though the sea itself had turned to steel. Not hundreds of ships, but thousands. Battleships, destroyers, landing craft. Vessels of every size and type covered the water. One observer whispered, "It is the whole world coming against us." The invasion fleet, 6,939 vessels strong, had arrived. The largest armada in human history. At 0535, the naval bombardment began. The first salvo from HMS Warspite thundered across the water, followed by the deep rumble of American battleships Texas and Arkansas. The air shook with such force that men inside bunkers felt their lungs compress. The ground itself seemed to ripple. In the bunker at WN62, So felt the world collapse around him. Concrete cracked. Dust filled the air. Men screamed as explosions buried them alive, then dug them out, only for another shell to come. Above them, the sky glowed with fire. The battleship USS Texas fired 255 14-inch shells at Pointe du Hoc in just over half an hour. Warspite alone hurled over 300 shells across 2 days. No German soldier, not even veterans of the Eastern Front, had witnessed such concentrated power. Bunkers built to survive anything crumbled like sand castles. The myth of the Atlantic Wall began to die before the first Allied soldier even reached the shore. When the bombardment lifted, the defenders were dazed but alive. Many emerged, coughing, ears ringing to man their weapons. Out at sea, the first landing craft began to approach. The Germans steadied their rifles. At WN62, Sau adjusted the sights of his MG-42. He watched the approaching boats through the smoke and said quietly, "Here they come." Far out on the water, the men of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions braced themselves. The ramps would drop soon. Every man knew that the first few minutes would decide everything. Private Shanklin remembered how the officer beside him whispered the Lord S. prayer as machine gun fire began to cut across the water. When the ramp fell, the man in front of him dropped instantly, and Shanklin dove into the cold, red-stained surf. Around him, chaos reigned. Men shouting, boats burning, water churned by bullets. Above it all, Sau's MG-42 roared, spitting fire from its steel throat. The invasion of Normandy had begun. For the young men on both sides of that beach, history was no longer something written in newspapers or speeches. It had come alive, terrible, deafening, unstoppable. And as the first waves of soldiers crawled through the rising tide under a sky filled with smoke and thunder, the world itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if freedom or tyranny would rule the century to come. As dawn brightened over the channel, the fog began to dissolve into a gray shimmer. From his bunker at WN62, Hinrich Sau peered through the gun sight and saw, for the first time, the full scale of what was coming toward him. Landing craft after landing craft stretched across the water, their wakes overlapping into one endless pattern of motion. The air carried the constant roar of engines, the deep thud of naval guns, and the faint cries of men drifting across the sea. It was no longer a battle forming, it was an event of nature, like a storm breaking across the horizon. At 06:30, the ramps of the first Higgins boats fell open. American soldiers charged forward, burdened with 60 pounds of gear, boots sinking into the cold surf. Some fell instantly, cut down before their boots even touched the sand. The machine gun in So's hands chattered to life. Each pull of the trigger sent the weapon bucking like a live thing, brass casings spilling across the floor. His loader fed the belts with trembling hands as they fired into the mass of moving figures below. Through the smoke, Seau could see bodies tumbling, water turning red, and yet the men kept coming. They crawled over obstacles, through barbed wire, through the bodies of their fallen. Every time he thought they would stop, another wave appeared behind them. He later wrote that his MG-42 burned so hot that he had to change barrels constantly, each one glowing dull red before warping from the heat. His position was one of the few still intact after the bombardment, commanding a clear field of fire across the center of Omaha Beach. From there, he watched as the landing turned into chaos. Landing craft struck mines and exploded. Tanks sank beneath the waves. Men clung to debris or huddled behind obstacles that offered little protection. For hours, the beach seemed to swallow every hope of survival. Yet, against all logic, the Allied soldiers persisted. Further west, near Vierville-sur-Mer, Lieutenant John Spaulding of the 116th Infantry Regiment found himself pinned behind a steel obstacle with a handful of men. The water around them hissed with incoming fire. He shouted for them to crawl, to keep moving. Each time someone rose to run, they fell within seconds. "We're trapped!" someone yelled. Spaulding looked up the beach and saw no cover, no safety, only the thin line of smoke where the shingle met the sand. Then he saw something else. Naval shells landing closer, their blasts tearing holes in the German defenses. Destroyers were moving dangerously close to shore, risking grounding to provide fire support. Their guns fired so near that the concussion waves knocked men flat, but with each blast, German fire slackened. Fire. On the German side, disbelief was spreading faster than any order could control. Radio operators shouted into headsets that produced only static. Telephone lines were dead, artillery batteries silent. Ammunition stocks ran dry far sooner than expected. The entire defensive strategy, meticulously planned for a limited assault, was unraveling under the sheer weight of the Allied attack. German artillerymen were forced to ration to 4 shells per gun by mid-morning. Every shell fired felt like a drop in the ocean. The Luftwaffe's response was pitiful. Oberst Josef Pips Priller, commander of Jagdgeschwader 26, received orders to attack the invasion fleet with his entire force. He famously replied, "What force? I have 2 planes." And so, in an act of defiance rather than strategy, Priller and his wingman, Unteroffizier Heinz Wodarczyk, took off in their FW-190s and dove toward the beaches. Their strafing run lasted less than 2 minutes, a single pass over Sword Beach, bullets skipping off steel and water before they turned for home. It was the only Luftwaffe attack on the beaches that morning, a gesture of bravery made meaningless by circumstance. The air above Normandy belonged entirely to the Allies. More than 14,000 Allied sorties filled the sky that day, while the Luftwaffe managed barely 300. By mid-morning, the battle for Omaha Beach had become a scene of unimaginable horror. Entire companies of American infantry were wiped out before reaching dry land. Communications officers were dead, radios destroyed by seawater, and units fought without coordination. Yet, amid the destruction, small acts of leadership and courage began to turn the tide. A handful of engineers cleared mines under fire. A tank that had miraculously made it ashore fired shell after shell into the cliffs. Medics moved among the fallen, dragging men out of the surf, ignoring bullets that snapped past their ears. Lieutenant Spaulding finally reached the shingle, breathless, half-deaf from the noise. Around him, men who had been strangers an hour ago were now brothers in survival. Together, they began climbing the bluffs, using the smoke and craters for cover. The German defenders watched in disbelief as the enemy began to appear on their flanks, moving up the very cliffs they believed impassable. So and his crew shifted their aim, spraying fire in desperate arcs. But the attackers kept coming, not as an organized army now, but as individuals driven by pure will. Behind the German lines, panic began to spread. Reports came in of paratroopers everywhere, American, British, Canadian, dropping behind their positions, cutting communication lines and ambushing convoys. The entire rear area seemed to dissolve into confusion. Villages that had been quiet hours before now echoed with sporadic gunfire. Resistance groups, awakened by coded messages from the BBC, sabotaged rail lines and destroyed bridges. German commanders, already overwhelmed, could no longer tell where the enemy truly was. It seemed as if he had materialized out of the air itself. At 10 Hesse, the 21st Panzer Division, the only armored unit close enough to influence the battle, finally received orders to move. But by then, the morning had been lost. Every road leading toward the coast was under constant air attack. Columns of tanks were torn apart by fighter bombers before they reached their assembly points. The pilots flew so low that some could see the faces of the German drivers before releasing their rockets. The roar of Allied aircraft was a continuous thunder overhead, the sound of a sky that no longer belonged to Germany. On the beaches, the struggle continued minute by minute, life by life. The water was thick with wreckage. Helmets, rifles, shattered boats. Corpsmen waded through it, searching for anyone still breathing. In one small cove, Sergeant Frank de Vita, a gunner on a landing craft, helped pull wounded men from the surf. Years later, he would remember one face above all others, a soldier missing half his gear, his eyes wide with disbelief, whispering, "Are we winning?" De Vita had no answer then. But by afternoon, as smoke from burning bunkers rose above the cliffs, the impossible began to happen. The German defenses, those concrete fortresses that were meant to hold forever, began to fall silent one by one. Inland, British and Canadian troops were advancing through the fields beyond Sword and Juno beaches. Paratroopers from the 6th Airborne Division had seized bridges over the Orne River. American paratroopers from the 101st and 82nd had captured towns like Sainte-Mère-Église, where one soldier famously hung from the church steeple, playing dead as the battle raged below. The night's confusion had turned into morning's success. The Allies were on the continent again. From his position at WN62, So realized that his world was collapsing. His ammunition was nearly gone, his comrades dead or wounded. The gun barrel glowed, warped from heat. The young soldier who had written home that the beach would be the Allies. Grave now watched as endless waves of men and machines filled it. He fired one last burst before his weapon jammed. When silence finally fell inside the bunker, he could hear the cries of wounded men on the sand below, the same men he had been trying to kill hours earlier. For a long moment, he simply stared at the devastation. There were so many, he would later recall, so many that the mind could no longer see them as soldiers, only as human beings. By midday, the beach was no longer a killing ground, but a lifeline. Engineers cleared obstacles. Medics established aid posts. Artillerymen landed and began to set up guns. The tide, which had swallowed so many lives, now carried in supplies, crates, jeeps, ammunition. The air smelled of smoke, oil, and blood. The battle for the beach was ending, but the battle for Normandy had just begun. Behind the smoke and courage, the scale of the struggle was still unfolding, one that would test not only armies, but entire nations, their faith, their endurance, and their humanity itself. By the afternoon of June 6th, the tide had turned not just in the physical sense, but in the flow of history itself. What had begun as a desperate struggle for survival on a narrow strip of sand was now expanding inland, kilometer by kilometer, field by field. The beaches, once soaked in chaos, were becoming arteries of movement, machines unloading, medics working, engineers rebuilding. Smoke curled skyward from shattered bunkers, and the cries of the wounded mixed with the drone of engines and the bark of orders shouted through exhaustion. The invasion had not failed. Against every expectation, it had succeeded. For the Germans defending Normandy, disbelief was beginning to harden into dread. Reports from the beaches were incoherent, many commanders unsure whether to trust what they heard. By the time Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt received confirmation of a full-scale landing, the window for decisive counterattack had already closed. He demanded permission to release the Panzer Division stationed farther inland, but permission had to come from Adolf Hitler himself. And Hitler, sleeping at his headquarters in Berchtesgaden, was not to be disturbed. The pause cost them everything. While staff officers debated whether the Normandy landings were merely a diversion for a larger assault at Calais, the Allies solidified their hold on the coast. Eisenhower's gamble, to land simultaneously across 5 beaches despite weather and risk, was proving sound. The German plan of defense, built on rigidity, could not adapt to such fluid chaos. In the fields beyond Omaha and Gold, farmers' stone walls and hedgerows turned into instant fortifications. The bocage country, as the Americans would soon call it, would slow their advance, but it would not stop it. On the British sector, Major John Howard and his men still held the Pegasus Bridge across the Orne River. They had landed in gliders in the first moments of D-Day, their wooden aircraft slamming into the fields just meters from their objective. For hours, they had fought off counterattacks, low on ammunition but unshaken. Now, as the sound of tank treads reached them, they feared the worst. But when the first Sherman tanks appeared over the rise, painted with the white star of the Allied forces, the exhausted soldiers cheered until their voices cracked. The bridge was secure. The flank was safe. The eastern door to Normandy was open. South of Omaha, American paratroopers were consolidating their chaotic drops. In the early hours, they had fallen scattered across the countryside, some miles from their intended zones, others in flooded fields or behind enemy lines. Yet that scattering had become a strange advantage. The Germans could not locate a single, organized airborne force to attack. Instead, small groups of paratroopers ambushed convoys, seized crossroads, and disrupted communication lines. In one village, an American lieutenant and a dozen men held off an entire company for half a day, convincing their opponents they faced a much larger unit. Fear, confusion, and rumor began to replace strategy among the German ranks. By evening, the 101st Airborne had captured Carentan's approaches, and the 82nd held Sainte-Mère-Église, the first town liberated in France. The church bell that had tolled through the night now rang freely, a sound no German soldier could silence. Meanwhile, on the beaches, General Omar Bradley surveyed Omaha from a command ship offshore. Through binoculars, he saw the beach littered with bodies and wreckage, yet he also saw movement. Bulldozers clearing lanes, jeeps ferrying wounded, engineers marking safe paths. It was far from organized, but it was progress. "We'll stay," he said simply, refusing suggestions to withdraw. It was one of the calmest, most resolute decisions of the war. Behind the front lines, Allied logistics began their astonishing rhythm. By dusk, over 156,000 men had landed along with nearly 10,000 vehicles. Supplies flowed through makeshift piers, and the first field hospitals opened on the sand itself. Chaplains moved among the rows of the dead, offering words that vanished into the wind. The beach, for all its triumph, remained a graveyard. For every yard gained, there were lives that would never leave Normandy. That evening, aboard the battleship HMS Warspite, British gunners rested beside still-smoking barrels. They had fired over 300 shells throughout the day, each one aimed at the coastal defenses ahead of Sword and Juno. The men were deafened, soot-streaked, their hands blistered from handling shells the size of a man's torso. Yet they knew the day's cost was necessary. If we failed, one sailor wrote in his journal that night, the world would have fallen dark for generations. Far inland, German commanders struggled to piece together a coherent defense. The 21st Panzer Division, battered by air attacks, finally reached the outskirts of Caen by nightfall, counterattacking the British 3rd Division. For a few terrifying hours, it appeared that the Allies might be pushed back into the sea. Tanks clashed at close range. Fields burned under tracer fire. But as dusk turned to night, Allied aircraft returned, even in the fading light, hammering the German positions until the counterattack faltered. The enemy fell back toward the city. Caen would not fall that night, but neither would it hold easily. As darkness settled over Normandy, the sounds of battle did not fade. The horizon flashed with artillery fire, the air thick with smoke and dust. In every direction the land itself seemed to tremble. Soldiers lay where they had fought, some asleep from exhaustion, others too afraid to close their eyes. The dead were gathered quietly under tarps or laid out in rows, each one a reminder of how narrow the line between life and death had become. In a farmhouse near the front, a German medic named Karl Neumann tended to the wounded from both sides. His unit had been cut off and the nearest field hospital was unreachable. By the light of a flickering lamp, he bandaged an American paratrooper who had stumbled in bleeding from a thigh wound. The man's face was pale but calm. "Danke," he murmured weakly, unsure what else to say. Neumann looked at him for a long moment before replying softly, "It's all right. Tonight we are just men." He had once believed that duty meant obeying orders without question. But in that moment, surrounded by groans and the smell of iodine, duty meant something far more human. Back in the Allied command ships offshore, generals conferred under dim red lights. Messages from the front painted a picture of both triumph and uncertainty. Utah, Gold, Juno, Sword, all secure. Omaha, fragile but holding. Airborne units, fragmented but effective. Casualties were high, far beyond expectation, yet the beachhead was intact. Eisenhower received the reports in silence, his face unreadable. Only when the last communique arrived, confirming that by nightfall every beach was in Allied hands, did he exhale slowly and whisper to his staff, "The free men of the world have begun to march to victory." On the other side, at Hitler's headquarters, chaos reigned. When he finally awoke around noon that day, the dictator was furious that his orders had been delayed. His staff had insisted the Normandy assault was a diversion, a trick meant to draw German forces away from Calais. Even now, as reports flooded in confirming the scale of the invasion, he refused to commit fully. "The real attack is still to come," he insisted. Hours passed as he debated phantom armies conjured by Allied deception. By the time he released the armored divisions held in reserve, Allied air supremacy had already sealed their fate. Columns of tanks that could have turned the tide were instead annihilated on the roads, burning wrecks marking the path of indecision. As midnight approached, the beaches glowed faintly in the light of distant fires. Ships continued to arrive through the dark, their silhouettes black against the sea. In every foxhole, men prayed, some for victory, some for sleep, some simply to survive another dawn. Above them, the sky was streaked with tracer fire and the distant hum of aircraft ferrying reinforcements. Normandy was alive with motion, with exhaustion, with the quiet realization that this was only the beginning. The invasion had succeeded, but the liberation of Europe had barely begun. The hardest days were still ahead. Dawn on June 7, 1944, came to Normandy not with relief, but with the grim awareness that survival had merely bought another day of fighting. The beaches that only hours before had been scenes of chaos were now sprawling military towns. Bulldozers carved roads through dunes. Cranes lifted wrecked landing craft, and endless lines of men and vehicles moved inland. The Allied invasion, so fragile the morning before, was now an iron machine expanding hour by hour. At Omaha, soldiers who had once fought from behind obstacles now dug trenches facing inland. Engineers laid metal matting over the sand to support trucks and tanks. Chaplains conducted services for the fallen in makeshift cemeteries near the bluff. There was no celebration, only exhaustion and a quiet, growing determination. Each man knew instinctively that the beach was no longer a destination, but a beginning. Farther inland, the first real test of the Allied foothold was unfolding. The city of Caen, the gateway to eastern Normandy, loomed as a crucial objective. It was the key to open plains beyond, perfect ground for tanks, but it was also fiercely defended. The 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, composed mostly of teenage soldiers led by hardened veterans, moved toward the city with ruthless speed. Many had grown up on propaganda declaring the Allies weak and decadent. Now, as they saw the endless columns pouring from the beaches, they began to sense the scale of what they faced. Still, they were unflinching. Fanaticism replaced fear. British and Canadian troops advancing toward Caen found themselves trapped in a brutal struggle. The open countryside gave way to hedgerows, dense earthen walls topped with tangled brush that turned every field into a fortress. Tanks became coffins in narrow lanes. Every corner hid a machine gun, every orchard a sniper. For days, progress was measured not in miles, but in meters. Soldiers crawled on their stomachs, inching through mud and wire while shells shattered the earth around them. A Canadian private, David Collier, later recalled the moment he realized the battle for Normandy would not be swift. "We thought once the beach was taken, France would open up before us, but the land itself fought us. Every hedge was a trench, every farmhouse a bunker. The Normandy countryside, so peaceful in memory, had become a labyrinth of death." On the American front, paratroopers of the 101st Airborne were fighting for Carentan, the small town linking Utah and Omaha beaches. Without it, the two sectors would remain isolated, vulnerable to counterattack. The fighting there was savage, house to house, room to room. Rain fell in sheets, turning the streets into rivers of mud. The crack of rifles and the roar of grenades echoed through the narrow alleys. In one street, Private James Albright dragged a wounded comrade into a doorway just as a panzer shell obliterated the wall opposite. "It felt like the world had cracked open," he wrote later. When the town finally fell, the exhausted paratroopers stood among the ruins, too numb to cheer. For the Germans, the scale of the invasion was becoming undeniable. Field Marshal Rommel, returning from Germany after celebrating his wife's birthday, drove through the night to reach his headquarters near Caen. What he saw on the way shocked him. Endless columns of burning vehicles, shattered bridges, and soldiers wandering without orders. The sky itself seemed alive with Allied aircraft. He knew then that the war had changed irreversibly. "We are facing an enemy who controls the air, the sea, and soon the land," he told his staff grimly. "Our only choice is to delay him." But even delay was costly. Allied bombers flattened towns suspected of harboring German troops. Roads became graveyards of trucks and horses. Civilians fled in carts piled with what little they could save. In the villages caught between both armies, the line between soldier and civilian blurred into tragedy. Farmers buried their livestock alongside neighbors. Churches served as hospitals, and prayers mingled with the sound of artillery. Normandy's liberation came with a price its people would carry for generations. By June 10th, the Allies had landed over 325,000 men and 54,000 vehicles. The sea lanes operated with clockwork precision, ships unloading supplies, returning and arriving again. Artificial harbors called mulberries, vast floating ports built in secrecy, began to take shape. From the air, they looked like great metallic islands. With them, the invasion no longer depended on capturing existing ports. Logistics had become a weapon as powerful as any gun. Still, the Germans refused to break. In the hedgerows south of Bayeux, the 352nd Infantry Division fought to the last man, holding ground inch by inch. For soldiers like Heinrich Soe, who had survived the first day at Omaha, the war had turned into a slow retreat through a collapsing world. His new position was a cratered orchard outside Isigny. The ground smelled of wet earth and death. Each night he watched Allied flares rise into the sky, lighting the battlefield like daylight. There was nowhere left to hide, he would later write. The war was around us, above us, inside us. Across the Channel, London celebrated the news of the successful landings with cautious joy. Bells rang in Westminster, and radios carried Churchill's voice across the empire. "This is not the end," he declared. "It is not even the beginning of the end. But it is, perhaps, the end of the beginning." For millions listening, the words carried both hope and dread. They knew that many more would die before Europe was free. In the Allied camps near the beaches, victory felt distant. Rain turned bivouacs into swamps. The wounded filled every tent. Letters home were written in haste, stained with mud or blood. Many began with the same words, "I am alive." Each day the soldiers learned new lessons about the terrain, the enemy, and themselves. They adapted. Riflemen learned to throw grenades over hedgerows without seeing the target. Tank crews welded sharpened steel to the fronts of their Shermans to break through the earthen walls. The battle for Normandy was becoming a brutal classroom in innovation under fire. By mid-June, the Germans attempted one last counterattack near Villers-Bocage. The legendary tank ace Michael Wittmann led his Tiger into battle, ambushing an entire British column. In minutes, he destroyed over a dozen vehicles, turning the road into a trail of fire and twisted metal. For a brief moment, it seemed that German steel could still defy Allied might, but the triumph was short-lived. Within days, Wittmann's tank was destroyed by air attack, and the counterattack collapsed. Heroism on either side could no longer alter the tide. For Allied soldiers resting on the beaches that night, the horizon flickered with artillery flashes from Caen. The sea whispered against the sand where thousands had fallen days earlier. A young British sergeant sat smoking beside a wrecked landing craft and wrote in his journal, "We came to liberate, but each step forward feels like another world lost." The words captured what many felt but could not say, that liberation and loss were becoming indistinguishable. In the darkness beyond, German soldiers moved silently through hedgerows, listening to the rumble of engines. Some had begun to doubt, others clung to duty. All were trapped in a war larger than themselves, commanded by men far away who still believed victory possible. Yet on both sides, under the same cold stars, the same question haunted every soldier Tige's heart. How much longer must this go on before the world could begin again? By late June, Normandy had become a vast, grinding battlefield, no longer defined by beaches or landings, but by hedgerows, villages, and the unending thunder of artillery. The invasion that had begun as a desperate gamble was now a relentless siege, fought yard by yard through the green labyrinth of northern France. What had started as chaos was now a war of endurance. The Germans clung to every rise and hedgerow with desperate resolve. For many, like Heinrich Soe and the remnants of his unit, retreat had become a daily ritual. Fall back, regroup, dig in again. Each morning brought new bombardments that flattened the landscape, erasing every familiar feature. "We stopped calling it France," Soe later wrote, "because nothing looked alive anymore, only fire and smoke." For the Allies, progress was painfully slow. Each hedgerow had to be assaulted as if it were a fortress. Platoons would advance through waist-high grass only to find themselves ambushed from hidden machine gun nests. Tanks bogged down in ditches or exploded on mines. The cost in lives was staggering. Some units lost half their men in a single afternoon. Medics worked without rest, their hands red and trembling, surrounded by cries that no longer shocked them. The air hung thick with cordite and the smell of turned soil and death. And yet, despite the exhaustion, the Allied armies learned. Every mistake became a lesson written in blood. Infantry and tank crews began to coordinate their assaults, using artillery to blast holes in the hedgerows. Engineers welded metal blades, rhino tusks, to the fronts of Sherman tanks, allowing them to plow through the earthen walls. Slowly, methodically, the invaders adapted to the land that had resisted them. The Germans, trapped in a defensive doctrine built on static lines, could not change as quickly. By July, the full weight of Allied logistics was visible everywhere. Endless convoys rolled through the dust. Fuel drums, ammunition crates, and field kitchens filled every road. Mobile repair shops fixed tanks where they stood. Behind the lines, soldiers found fleeting moments of peace. Letters from home, a cigarette shared, the smell of coffee boiling on a tin stove. These brief, human pauses were the fragile threads holding them together. Every man knew that tomorrow would demand everything again. In early July, the Battle of Caen reached its brutal climax. The city, once known for its churches and quiet gardens, had been reduced to rubble by weeks of bombing. British and Canadian forces advanced through streets of shattered stone, fighting block by block against fanatical resistance. Civilians hid in cellars, emerging only when the guns fell silent for a few minutes at a time. One old woman, her house destroyed, offered tea to passing soldiers from a dented kettle. "You must be tired," she told them softly. In that moment, amid destruction, the smallest kindness became sacred. By mid-July, Caen finally fell. The victory came at terrible cost. Tens of thousands of lives lost on both sides, but it marked the turning point. The German front line was fracturing. Supplies dwindled, replacements never arrived, and the once mighty Wehrmacht was now fighting in fragments. Rommel himself, the Desert Fox, had been gravely wounded when his car was strafed by Allied aircraft. Leadership faltered as reality set in. The war in the West was lost. Still, Hitler refused to yield. Orders from Berlin demanded that every position be held to the last man. Entire towns became tombs because no one was allowed to retreat. Even as Allied bombers turned the night sky red and tanks rolled unopposed through the countryside, German soldiers fought on with grim fatalism. We had no illusions left, so remembered. But we fought because the men beside us were all we had left. On July 25th, the Americans launched Operation Cobra, a massive air and ground offensive designed to break the stalemate. Thousands of bombers roared overhead, releasing a storm of explosives that shook the earth for miles. The bombardment was so powerful that men miles away felt the ground ripple beneath their boots. When the dust cleared, the German lines had been obliterated. What followed was not a battle, but a collapse. Tanks surged through the gaps, infantry poured forward, and suddenly the front that had held for nearly 2 months began to unravel. In the following days, towns that had been names on maps, Saint-Lô, Coutances, Avranches, were liberated one by one. Columns of German prisoners trudged along the roads, their faces blank with fatigue. Civilians emerged from hiding, weeping, waving flags, pressing flowers into soldiers' hands. Liberation was no longer an idea. It had become a sight, a touch, a sound, the laughter of children who had forgotten what peace sounded like. For the Allies, the advance was unstoppable. The beaches that had once been killing grounds were now bustling ports, unloading entire armies daily. Supplies flowed like rivers, fuel, food, ammunition, feeding an engine of liberation that now rolled toward Paris. Behind the lines, Eisenhower walked among the men who had survived the landings. "You are the hope of the free world," he told them quietly. The men simply nodded. They had seen too much to call themselves heroes. In August, as German forces retreated eastward, the Falaise pocket closed, the final act of the Normandy campaign. Thousands of German soldiers were trapped, their escape routes cut off by converging Allied armies. The fields filled with smoke and bodies. One German officer described it as the graveyard of an army. When the guns finally fell silent, the road to Paris lay open. Heinrich So was captured near Troon, his uniform torn, his weapon long discarded. He was 20 years old. Sitting in a prisoner column under the summer sun, he watched American soldiers handing water to their captives. The war had stripped away ideology, leaving only exhaustion and understanding. "We were no longer enemies," he wrote later. "We were survivors of the same storm." On August 25th, Paris was liberated. Crowds filled the boulevards, weeping, singing, embracing soldiers as tanks rolled past the Arc de Triomphe. Church bells that had been silent for 4 years rang across the city. In London and New York, in Moscow and Ottawa, the news spread like sunlight breaking through clouds. Yet for those who had fought through the hedgerows and beaches, the celebration felt distant. They knew how many would never return to see it. When the battle for Normandy ended, over 425,000 men, Allied and German, had been killed, wounded, or captured. The landscape itself bore the scars. Villages erased, fields cratered, trees splintered by fire. The price of freedom had been written into the soil of France. Years later, veterans from both sides would return to those beaches. Old men now, walking slowly across the sand that had once been soaked in fear. They would look out over the calm channel, the gulls circling lazily, and wonder how the world had ever been so violent. Flowers would be laid, prayers whispered, and silence would fall, an echo of the storm that had once changed the course of history. In that silence lies the truth of D-Day. Not a story of conquest, but of endurance, of courage shared by men who bled on opposite sides, and of a generation that stood together knowingly or not at the turning point of civilization. Normandy became not just a place of battle, but a symbol, a reminder that freedom, once won, is never free, and that even in the darkest hour humanity's light can still find its way through the smoke.